The October light had turned golden and slanting by the time I finished setting the table, each piece of silverware placed with the kind of meticulous care that betrayed my nervousness, my hand smoothing the linen napkins for the third time as I caught my reflection in the dining room mirror, and wondered if a mother was supposed to feel this anxious about meeting the woman her son loved, or if this particular flutter in my chest was something else entirely. Anticipation mixed with a loneliness I hadn't quite acknowledged until Daniel's phone call 3 days ago had sent a current of hope through the quiet rooms of this house that had felt too large, too empty, ever since James died. I stepped back to survey my work, the table set for 3 where it had been set for 1 for so many months, the good china that had belonged to James's mother catching the afternoon light in a way that made me think of all the family dinners we'd hosted over the years, all the celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays alike, and I felt the familiar ache of his absence like a hand pressed against my sternum, though today that ache was tempered by something brighter, something that felt almost like the future arriving at my doorstep in the form of my son's happiness. The roast had another 20 minutes, and I found myself moving through the kitchen with the restless energy of someone who needed to keep her hands busy, checking the potatoes that didn't need checking, stirring the gravy that didn't need stirring, adjusting the temperature on the oven that was already perfectly calibrated, because if I stopped moving I might start thinking too hard about how much this moment meant to me, how desperately I wanted Daniel to be happy after watching him shoulder so much grief in the 2 years since we lost James, how he'd thrown himself into his work with an intensity that worried me even as I understood it, recognized it as the same mechanism I'd employed to survive my own losses, though mine were older, buried deeper, hidden in places I never let myself examine too closely. I had raised Daniel to be kind, to be thoughtful, to choose his partners with care rather than haste, and so when he'd called me with that particular tremor in his voice that mothers learn to recognize, the sound of a heart making itself vulnerable, I had known immediately that this woman, this Sophia, was different from the casual girlfriends he'd mentioned over the years, the relationships that had flickered and faded like candles in a draft, leaving no real mark on him. "Mom, I want you to meet her," he had said, and there was something almost pleading in his tone, as if he needed my approval more than he was willing to admit, as if he understood that after losing his father, I had become the keeper of our family's blessing, the one whose opinion carried the weight of both parents now. "She's special and I know you're going to love her, and I just want everything to be perfect because she's never really had a family, not like we had, and I want her to feel welcome, to feel like she belongs somewhere. You know?" And I had known, had felt my throat tighten with emotion at the tenderness in his words, at the evidence that I had somehow raised a man who could love someone else's wounds as carefully as his own, who could see past his own needs to what another person was carrying, and I had told him yes, of course, bring her home, bring her to dinner, I would make his favorite meal and set out the good china and be the mother he needed me to be, though I had not said aloud that I was also hoping she might fill some of the silence in this house, might eventually bring grandchildren who would make these rooms feel alive again. I moved to the living room window and looked out at the street, the maple trees that lined our quiet suburban road ablaze with autumn color, their leaves a riot of crimson and gold that seemed almost too vivid against the cloudless blue of the sky, and I remembered how James used to say that October in Connecticut was God showing off, pulling out all the stops before the gray dormancy of winter settled in like a long-held breath. The neighborhood was the same as it had been for the 25 years we'd lived here, the houses well-maintained and familiar, the sidewalks where I'd pushed Daniel in his stroller and later taught him to ride his bike without training wheels, where I'd walked every morning after James died because movement was the only thing that kept the grief from calcifying in my bones, and I felt a sudden surge of gratitude for the continuity of this place, for the way it had held me through every iteration of myself, young wife, new mother, widow, and now this, whatever this was, this woman waiting to meet the mother of the man she loved. Their car pulled into the driveway at precisely 6 o'clock, and I watched through the sheer curtains as Daniel emerged from the driver's side, tall and lean in the navy sweater I'd given him last Christmas, his dark hair slightly too long in a way that made him look younger than 28, more like the college student he'd been not so long ago. And then he moved to the passenger side and opened the door with a gentlemanly flourish that made my heart squeeze because James had taught him that, had modeled that kind of thoughtful courtesy in 1,000 small ways throughout Daniel's childhood. The woman who stepped out of the car was smaller than I'd expected, delicate-boned and graceful, with long dark hair that caught the slanting sunlight and shimmered with hints of auburn, and even from this distance I could see that she was beautiful in an almost ethereal way, the kind of beauty that seemed somehow fragile, as if she might bruise easily, and I watched as Daniel took her hand and said something that made her laugh, her head tilting back in a gesture that was utterly unself-conscious, utterly natural, and I felt myself relax slightly because anyone who could make my serious, sometimes too intense son laugh like that had to be good for him. I stepped away from the window and moved to the front door, smoothing my hands down the front of my dress, a simple burgundy sheath that James had always liked, that I still wore sometimes when I wanted to feel close to him, and I was reaching for the doorknob when Daniel's key turned in the lock and the door swung open and there he was, my son, grinning at me with the kind of unguarded joy I hadn't seen on his face in years, and behind him, stepping across the threshold of my home, was the woman who had put that light back in his eyes. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice warm with affection and pride. "This is Sophia Chan, and Sophia, this is my mother Margaret Rivers, who I've been telling you about non-stop for the past week." He moved aside to let her fully into the foyer, and I stepped forward with my hand extended and my mouth already forming words of welcome, some pleasant greeting that would set the right tone for the evening, that would make this beautiful young woman feel embraced by our small fractured family, but the words died on my lips before they could take shape because I was looking at her face, really looking at it for the first time, and something inside my chest went cold and tight and impossibly still. The birthmark on her left wrist was small, barely the size of a dime, a pale strawberry-colored mark that most people probably never noticed, that she herself might have forgotten was there, but I saw it the moment she extended her hand to shake mine, saw it with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes when the universe tilts on its axis and everything you thought you knew rearranges itself into a new and terrible pattern. Her eyes were an unusual shade of amber, almost gold in the light from the foyer chandelier, with dark rings around the irises that made them seem even more luminous, more striking, and I had seen those eyes before, had seen them staring up at me from a hospital bassinet 26 years ago, had memorized every detail of that tiny face in the 1 hour I'd been allowed to hold her before the social worker came to take her away, before I signed the papers that severed every legal tie between us, that sent her into a system I could only pray would be kind to her, would give her the life I couldn't provide, the safety I couldn't guarantee. The tilt of her head when Daniel had made her laugh outside. I had seen that gesture in the mirror 1,000 times, had watched my own mother do the same thing, had recognized it as something genetic, something that ran through the women in my family like a silver thread, and now here it was, embodied in this stranger who was not a stranger at all, who was standing in my foyer looking at me with a mixture of hope and nervousness, waiting for me to say something, to do something, to be the welcoming maternal figure that Daniel had promised her I would be. "Mrs. Rivers?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with just a hint of uncertainty that made her seem younger than her years, and I realized I was still standing there with my hand frozen in midair, my face undoubtedly registering the shock that was cascading through my system like ice water, and I forced myself to move to complete the gesture, to take her hand in mine even though touching her felt like touching a ghost, a memory made flesh, a past I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself it was a dream. Her skin was warm and soft, and I felt the tremor in her fingers that suggested she was nervous too, that she wanted to make a good impression, and the knowledge that she cared what I thought of her made everything infinitely worse because I could not tell her what I was thinking, could not say what I was feeling, could not articulate the impossible truth that was screaming in my head with increasing volume and urgency. "Please call me Margaret," I managed to say, and my voice sounded almost normal, almost steady, though I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was certain they could both hear it, could see the pulse jumping in my throat. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel has told me so much about you, and I'm just delighted that you could come for dinner." The words were automatic, the kind of polite formulas that years of hosting had ingrained in me, and I clung to them like a life raft as I released her hand and stepped back, gesturing toward the living room with what I hoped was a welcoming smile. Daniel was watching me with a slight furrow between his brows, and I knew he had caught something in my reaction, some hesitation or strangeness that didn't fit with the enthusiasm I'd expressed over the phone. But Sophia was already moving into the living room with an appreciative murmur about how lovely the house was, how warm and inviting, and I followed them both with legs that felt disconnected from my body, with a mind that was racing through every impossible coincidence, every statistical improbability, trying to convince myself that I was wrong, that I was seeing patterns where none existed, that grief and loneliness had made me susceptible to magical thinking. But I knew, even as I tried to deny it, even as I poured wine with hands that shook only slightly and asked Sophia about her work as a graphic designer and listened to her describe the projects she was passionate about. The way she lit up when she talked about color theory and visual storytelling, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that defied logic or reason that this woman, this beautiful, poised, accomplished young woman whom my son loved, whom he was looking at with eyes that held his entire future, was my daughter, the baby I had held for 1 hour 26 years ago before surrendering her to strangers, the child I had tried not to think about every day since, the ghost who haunted the margins of every milestone in Daniel's life because I could not help but wonder what she was doing, who she was becoming, whether she was happy or safe or loved. She was sitting on my sofa, accepting the glass of wine I offered her, telling me with a self-deprecating laugh that she'd grown up in foster care in New York, that she'd bounced between homes until she aged out of the system at 18, that she'd put herself through community college and then art school on scholarships and student loans and sheer determination, and the whole time she was talking I was calculating dates and locations, fitting the pieces together with a growing sense of horror. Because everything matched, every detail aligned with what I knew about the adoption, about where I had given birth, about the agency I had used. I've always felt like something was missing, you know? Sophia said, leaning forward slightly in that earnest way that young people have when they're trying to articulate something important, something they've never quite found the words for before. Like there was this hole in my life where a family should be, where roots and history and belonging should be, and I spent so much of my childhood making up stories about where I came from, who my birth parents were, why they gave me up. She glanced at Daniel, and the look that passed between them was so tender, so full of unspoken understanding, that I had to look away. But meeting Daniel, being welcomed into your family, it feels like maybe I'm finally finding what I've been looking for. Like maybe I can stop searching and just be present, just be grateful for what I have right now. I excused myself to check on dinner, my voice sounding strangled even to my own ears, and I fled to the kitchen where I braced myself against the counter and tried to breathe, tried to think, tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with this information that felt like a bomb ticking in my chest, because telling them the truth meant destroying everything. Daniel's happiness, Sophia's hope, the future they were so clearly building together. I pressed my hands against my face and felt the tears threatening to spill over, felt the weight of every choice I had ever made pressing down on me like a physical force, and I understood in that moment that the past was not past at all, that it was alive and present and sitting in my living room, that the girl I had tried to save by giving her away had found her way back to me in the cruelest possible way, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, I could do to stop what was coming without breaking all of our hearts in the process. The November light was different this year, softer somehow, as if the world itself had learned something about gentleness in the months since everything had shattered and slowly, painstakingly, begun to reassemble itself into a shape none of us had anticipated but all of us were learning to inhabit. And I stood at my kitchen window watching the first snow of the season drift down in lazy spirals, thinking about how a year ago I could never have imagined that this Thanksgiving would look the way it did, with place cards arranged around my dining table that spelled out a family configuration so complex and unlikely that it seemed like something from a novel, rather than my actual life. The turkey was in the oven, filling the house with the familiar scent of rosemary and thyme that had marked every November of my adult life, and I was making James's mother's cornbread stuffing from memory because I had made it so many times that my hands knew the recipe better than my mind did. And there was something comforting in the repetition of these rituals, in the way certain traditions endured even when everything else had transformed beyond recognition, even when the people gathered around the table were connected by bonds so tangled and unexpected that explaining them to outsiders required diagrams and deep breaths and a willingness to accept that family was sometimes less about clean lines than it was about choosing to show up, choosing to try, choosing to love even when love required more courage than seemed humanly possible. Helen arrived first, letting herself in through the front door with the casual familiarity of someone who had been walking into this house for decades, her arms full of the sweet potato casserole she brought every year and a bottle of wine that she thrust at me with a meaningful look that said she knew today was going to be emotionally complex and wanted to make sure I had fortification available. "How are you holding up?" she asked, following me into the kitchen and immediately taking over the task of mashing potatoes because she knew I needed something to do with my hands, needed the comfort of working alongside someone who had known me long enough to read my silences. "I'm honestly not sure," I admitted, checking the turkey and basting it with more attention than was strictly necessary, using the heat from the oven as an excuse for the flush I could feel creeping up my neck. I keep waiting for it to feel less surreal, for there to be some moment when this new reality stops feeling like I'm living in someone else's life. But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe this constant low-grade sense of disbelief is just what it feels like to be given back something you thought you'd lost forever, even if it comes in a package you never could have predicted. She was quiet for a moment, her hands working the potato masher with steady, rhythmic movements, and when she spoke again her voice was gentle in the way that only family can achieve. The kind of gentleness that comes from truly knowing someone's history, their failures and fears as well as their strengths. You know, when James told me about what had happened before you two met, about the baby you'd given up, I remember thinking how impossibly brave you were, how much strength it must have taken to make that choice when you were barely more than a child yourself, terrified and alone and trying to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, she said, not looking at me but focusing on the potatoes as if they required her complete concentration. And then when you called me that night after the dinner with Daniel and Sophia, when you were barely coherent through your tears trying to explain what you'd realized, I thought, my God, what kind of cosmic cruelty is this? What kind of universe would bring her daughter back to her in the one way that made everything impossible? But now, watching how you've all navigated this past year, watching how you found a way through something that should have destroyed you, I think maybe it wasn't cruelty at all. Maybe it was just life being as complicated and painful and beautiful as it always is, giving us what we need in forms we would never choose for ourselves. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted whatever I might have said in response, and I felt my pulse quicken with the particular anxiety that had become familiar over the past months, the fear that this fragile piece we'd constructed might shatter at any moment, that someone would say the wrong thing or look at someone else the wrong way and all the careful healing we'd done would unravel like a sweater with a pulled thread. But when I looked out the window I saw Sophia getting out of her car, and the young man who emerged from the passenger side was someone I'd met only once before, a kind-faced software engineer named Marcus whom she'd been seeing for the past 2 months, and the way he took her hand as they walked up the path to my door, the way she leaned into him slightly as if drawing strength from his presence, made something in my chest relax because I could see that she was building a life, finding happiness in spaces that had nothing to do with the complicated grief and joy of our reconstituted family, and that was exactly what I wanted for her, exactly what any mother would want. I opened the door before they could knock, and Sophia's face when she saw me was still slightly uncertain, still carrying the residue of all the months when we hadn't known how to be around each other, when every conversation had felt like navigating a minefield of things we couldn't say and emotions we didn't know how to express. But there was also something warmer there now, something that looked almost like affection, and when she stepped forward to hug me I let myself hold her just a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, let myself feel the miracle of her solid presence in my arms, the reality of her breathing and alive and here after 26 years of wondering. Margaret, this is Marcus, she said, stepping back and gesturing to the man beside her. And I shook his hand and welcomed him in and tried not to think about how strange it was that I was meeting my daughter's boyfriend as if I were any normal mother, as if our relationship weren't built on a foundation of secrets and revelations and the kind of pain that left scars even as it healed. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, letting himself in with his key and calling out a greeting that sounded almost normal, almost like the easy relationship we'd had before everything had imploded. Though I knew from our weekly therapy sessions that he was still working through layers of betrayal and confusion and grief for the uncomplicated family narrative he believed in for most of his life. He had brought his new girlfriend, a woman named Rachel whom I'd met several times now and genuinely liked, a nurse with a sharp sense of humor and a directness that seemed good for my sometimes too serious son, and watching him with her, seeing the way he was learning to trust again, learning to open himself to the possibility of love without the shadow of our family's drama hanging over everything, filled me with a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. He came to me in the kitchen and kissed my cheek, and I could feel the residual tension in his shoulders, the way he was still holding himself slightly apart as if protecting himself from being hurt again. But he was here, he had come, and that felt like more than I had any right to hope for in the early months when he'd refused my calls and I had thought I might have lost him forever. We gathered around the table as the afternoon light began to fade, 7 of us in total when we should have been 3 or 5 or some other configuration that made sense, and I looked around at these faces, some familiar, some new, all of them connected to me through invisible threads of biology and choice and the kind of love that doesn't follow blueprints. And I felt the weight of James's absence like an 8th presence at the table, the ghost of the man who should have been here to see this, to help me navigate this impossible situation with the wisdom and steadiness that had been his gift. But I also felt, for the first time in the 2 years since he died, like he would have been proud of how I'd handled this, how I'd chosen truth over comfortable lies even when the truth threatened to destroy everything, how I'd fought to keep the connections that mattered even when those connections required us all to become different versions of ourselves, more honest, more vulnerable, more willing to sit with discomfort and uncertainty and the knowledge that families were sometimes messy and complicated and nothing like the greeting card versions we'd been sold. I asked Daniel to carve the turkey, a job that had been his father's and that I'd been doing myself for the past 2 years, and I saw understanding flash across his face, recognition that I was offering him something, inviting him to step into a role that signified continuity and tradition, and the possibility that we could build new rituals even as we honored old ones. He stood at the head of the table with the carving knife, and for a moment he looked so much like James that I had to blink back tears, had to remind myself that grief was allowed to coexist with joy, that I could miss my husband and be grateful for this moment simultaneously, that emotions didn't have to be pure or simple to be real. "Before we eat, I'd like to say something," Sophia said, her voice quiet but clear, and everyone turned to look at her. And I felt my heart begin to race because we had been so careful in these gatherings to keep things light, to avoid the heavy conversations that might tip us back into the chaos of those early days. But she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between nervousness and determination. When I first found out that Margaret was my birth mother, I felt like everything I thought I knew about myself had been a lie, like the universe was playing some kind of sick joke on me by giving me a family, and then immediately taking it away in the most painful way possible, she said, and her voice wavered slightly but she kept going, kept holding my gaze across the table. I was angry at her for giving me up, angry at her for not somehow recognizing me the moment I walked through her door, angry at the entire situation for being so impossibly complicated that there was no way through it that didn't involve someone getting hurt, and I spent months refusing to talk to either her or Daniel because I couldn't figure out how to process all of that anger and grief and confusion. She paused, reaching for her water glass and taking a sip, and I could see her gathering her thoughts, could see the effort it was taking for her to articulate something she'd clearly been working on for a long time. But therapy has taught me, and time has taught me, and honestly just living through this past year has taught me, that Margaret made the choice she made when she was younger than I am now, when she was terrified and alone and trying to protect me from something I still don't fully understand, and that she's been living with that choice for 26 years, carrying it around like a stone in her chest, and when she recognized me that night, she had to make another impossible choice, had to decide whether to tell the truth and destroy everyone's happiness or stay silent, and let something happen that she knew was wrong. The silence in the room was absolute, everyone holding their breath, and I could feel tears streaming down my face though I didn't remember starting to cry, and Sophia's eyes were bright with unshed tears as well as she continued. The fact that she chose truth, the fact that she was willing to lose both of us, willing to have us hate her, willing to blow up her own life in order to protect us from making a terrible mistake, that's the most profound act of maternal love I can imagine, and it took me a long time to see that, to understand that everything she's done, from the moment I was born until right now, has been about trying to keep me safe even when keeping me safe meant breaking her own heart. She turned to Daniel then and her voice softened. "And you're the brother I never knew I needed, and I'm sorry that finding me cost you the relationship you thought you were building. I'm sorry for all the pain and confusion, but I'm also grateful because you've shown me what it means to be part of a family, what it means to have someone who shares my history even if that history is more complicated than either of us wanted it to be, and I think maybe we can build something good from all this wreckage, something that honors what we've lost while also celebrating what we've found." Daniel cleared his throat, and I could see that he was struggling with his own emotions, his face working through expressions too quickly for me to categorize, and when he spoke his voice was rough with feeling. "I spent months being furious at Mom for not telling me the truth about her past, for not somehow preventing this whole situation, as if she could have predicted that the woman I fell in love with would turn out to be the daughter she gave up for adoption before I was even born, and it wasn't until my therapist pointed out how insane that expectation was, how impossible it would have been for her to navigate that situation without someone getting hurt, that I started to understand that maybe there were no good choices, only less terrible ones, and she made the best decision she could with impossible circumstances." He looked at me, and I saw forgiveness in his eyes, tentative and hard-won but real. I'm still working through it. I'm still figuring out how to be your son and Sophia's brother and a person who exists independently of all this family drama. But I'm here, I'm trying, and I think that's all any of us can do right now. Just keep showing up and being honest and trusting that eventually the wound will heal even if the scar never completely fades. We ate then, passing dishes around the table in a choreography that was both familiar and strange, and the conversations that rose and fell around me felt like music, like proof that life continued, that we could share a meal and laugh at Marcus's story about a disastrous coding project and debate whether pumpkin or apple pie was superior and exist as something resembling a normal family even though nothing about us was normal. Nothing about this situation followed any script I'd ever been given. I watched Sophia lean across the table to steal a roll from Daniel's plate with the kind of casual sibling intimacy that made my heart ache with bittersweet joy. Watched Rachel rest her hand on Daniel's arm with an easy affection that suggested she was becoming woven into the fabric of his life. Watched Helen catch my eye and raise her wine glass in a small, private toast that acknowledged everything we'd survived to get to this moment. And I thought about how James used to say that the measure of a life wasn't whether you avoided suffering, but whether you let that suffering transform you into someone more capable of compassion, more able to sit with complexity and uncertainty, and the knowledge that most of the important questions don't have clean answers. Later, after the dishes were done and the leftovers distributed and the guests had departed with hugs that lasted longer than usual, as if we were all acknowledging the significance of having made it through this day intact, I found myself alone in the quiet house with the scent of turkey and cinnamon still hanging in the air like a benediction, and I thought about the girl I'd been at 26, terrified and desperate, making the hardest choice of her life in a sterile hospital room with no one to hold her hand, and I wished I could go back and tell her that the baby she was giving up would be all right, would grow up to be strong and talented and capable of loving fiercely even after being given every reason not to trust, and that someday, in a twist of fate too improbable for fiction, she would find her way back and they would sit around a table together and pass the gravy and argue about politics and be something that resembled a family, and that all the years of wondering and grieving and carrying that secret like a wound that never quite healed would somehow, impossibly, be worth it for this moment of chaotic, complicated, beautiful connection. I stood at the window watching the snow fall more heavily now, covering the familiar landscape in a blanket of white that made everything look new and strange and full of possibility. And I understood that this was what grace looked like. Not the absence of pain but the presence of love strong enough to survive it. Not the erasing of the past but the integration of it into a present that acknowledged all the broken pieces while refusing to let them define the whole. And I felt, perhaps for the first time since James died, perhaps for the first time in 26 years, something that felt like peace, fragile and hard-won and precious beyond measure, settling over me like snow, like blessing, like the answer to prayers I hadn't known how to articulate but had been whispering into the darkness all along. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom the day Sophia called me Mom for the second time, their petals drifting through the air like pink snow as we walked through the park near my house on a Saturday afternoon in late April, and unlike the first time she'd used that word, tentatively, almost experimentally, at that first Thanksgiving dinner when we were all still so fragile, still testing whether this new family configuration could hold our weight, this time it came out naturally, embedded in a sentence about whether I wanted to come to her apartment the following weekend to help her hang some artwork, and I almost missed it because it sounded so ordinary, so much like the kind of thing any daughter might say to her mother, but then the word registered and I felt my steps falter just slightly, felt my breath catch in that way that had become familiar over the past year and a half, that sensation of being given something I'd stopped believing I deserved. I'd love that, I said, keeping my voice steady even though everything inside me wanted to stop walking and pull her into my arms, and tell her that every time she called me Mom it felt like a small miracle, like a door opening that I'd thought was permanently sealed. But I was learning to let these moments be simple, to accept them without drowning them in the weight of everything they meant, because Sophia and I were still learning how to be mother and daughter in a way that acknowledged our history without being crushed by it. And part of that learning was allowing ordinary affection to exist without constantly excavating it for deeper meaning.